Something I enjoy doing from time to time is going back and reading reviews for games from previous eras. There is a sense of nostalgia reading about a major game release and how it was reviewed back then. Contemporary reviews can often be much different than how we remember a game years later, or how popular a game ended up becoming despite less than stellar reviews. In this video, we will be perusing reviews of Morrowind and finding out how video game publications, mostly major magazines back then, thought how good Morrowind was. Of course, Morrowind was an interesting release for its time. Released all the way back in 2002, there really weren't many games like it, and then there was the added element of a console version of the game. So we really have two different experiences here. Bethesda has talked at length about the changes they had to make to the game to get it to run on the original Xbox, as well as with a controller versus a keyboard. Anyone who's fired up Morrowind on PC knows that it doesn't even include controller support. Therefore, we will be covering both PC and console reviews for the game. It really is interesting seeing how game reviewers look at a seminal game like Morrowind at the time. This was a different era of gaming, one that saw the medium as much more niche and stereotyped than it is now. For console users, a game like Morrowind was something else entirely. There really hadn't been anything like this on consoles ever before. Sure, some PC games had moved over to consoles in much more stripped down forms, like Doom, Quake, StarCraft 64, or even Diablo, but Morrowind was essentially a new type of game. Western RPGs weren't really a thing on consoles, so there was an entire universe of gamers completely unaware of what lay in store for them in Morrowind. The most interesting reviews come from that perspective, in my opinion. So we will start by looking at my favorite magazine from back in the day, Electronic Gaming Monthly. Morrowind represented a game with such ambition and such a broad scope that it essentially dwarfed really anything seen before on consoles. It was released very early in the original Xbox's life and was exclusive to the console. The Xbox version of the game came a month after the PC release. So what did Electronic Gaming Monthly have to say? Well, I'll give you their overview for the game and then their scores. EGM states, quote, "The first Xbox RPG has finally arrived and it's a doozy. Forget what you know about console role-playing games. Morrowind changes everything. This PC interloper invades the realm of console gaming with a style of play that bears little resemblance to that of Japanese RPGs like Final Fantasy and Dragon Warrior. You won't find any spiky-haired youths, turn-based battles, or linear one-truck storylines here. In this game, it is just you, alone in a massive fantasy world with complete freedom to do as you choose. You determine every aspect of your hero's appearance, attributes, and abilities. If you're unhappy with the available character class options, well then design your own custom class. When you want to take a break from the main storyline, embark on one of over 400 optional quests. These miscellaneous tasks will score you a lot of cool items and status aids. But sometimes you might need a respite from questing altogether. Try some sightseeing. The world of Vardenfell provides excellent hiking grounds with 10 square miles of terrain to explore. Or maybe you're not cut out to be a heroic do-gooder. If that's the case, start systematically slaughtering townsfolk and stealing all their loot. It's all up to you, and the adventure could literally go on for months." End quote. So now we get to their scores. If you love Morrowind, be prepared. And keep in mind that back then, for print publications anyways, these reviewers were given about a paragraph to summarize an entire game and provide a score. Imagine for a moment that your job was to play a game like Morrowind for 50 to 100 hours, assess it, give it a score, and then write about it. But you only get about a paragraph of space to do so. The job must have been incredibly difficult, but it is all we had back then. Electronic Gaming Monthly's format at this time was to have either 3 or 4 different people review the game, and each of them provided their own score. The first reviewer, named Shane, had this to say, quote, "I'm not sure if you guys are ready for this one. I've played nearly every console RPG from the past 20 years, a few PC quests, and even a multi-year live-action D&D campaign, and I was still overwhelmed by the enormous scope of Morrowind. This game thrusts you into a complex living world that is also a bit daunting. Following the tenuous main quest can be tricky, as optional side quests constantly lure you away from the path. It's all so open-ended and freeform that you can easily get lost in the world and forget about the game proper. It's enough to make your head swim, which is itself pretty impressive and scary. At least all of this monumental adventuring looks fabulous. Traditional swamps, forests, and plains look great, and the more creative areas will astound you. Exploring a Venetian-style canal town or a city filled with insectoid buildings is simply awe-inspiring. If only the gameplay could match the quality of the visuals. To put it simply, Morrowind's battle system sucks. It's slow, clunky, vague, and boring. Luckily, combat isn't too terribly frequent, so the game's not completely ruined. Even so, I do think Morrowind deserves a caveat. It's so dauntingly huge that the average gamer might not have the fortitude to stick with it through the first day, much less its entirety. However, for a certain type of player, say a bored dude with no summer job, it's a fabulous time waster." End quote. Shane's less than stellar review awards Morrowind a 7.0. The next reviewer, Jonathan, had this to say, quote, "Holy hell, am I exhausted. Morrowind's easily the biggest, most hardcore behemoth of an RPG I've ever played. It's so open-ended that you actually feel lost right from your Babe in the Woods beginning. Once I learned that grilling every villager for info was the key to getting jobs, joining guilds and political factions, eventually establishing an identity and reputation for myself, things came a lot more easily. But between the awkward PC RPG combat, having to cover a veritable Nebraska of ground to complete even small jobs, and trying to absorb all the prattling of the townsfolk, I can't imagine anyone but the hardest of hardcore appreciating Morrowind." End quote. Jonathan gives Morrowind a 7.5. The final EGM review of Morrowind comes from Mark, who says this, quote, "This is as close as a console RPG has come to pen and paper games like D&D. Deep, non-linear, and huge, with more characters, towns, and dungeons than you can imagine. All that's missing is the dice and Mountain Dew. It's way too much to go into here, and honestly at times it's overwhelming. The intricacies for the very cool abilities to make your own spells and magic items alone could fill a book. Combat isn't so hot, and you spend way too much time reading the same text talking to people. But if you have the time and are willing to commit to a seriously in-depth RPG, Final Fantasy it ain't. The freedom Morrowind allows will astound you." End quote. Mark gives it EGM's highest review score at 8.5, and I love the Mountain Dew reference. These reviews show just how out of their element these console reviewers were. It was a different time, and you'd likely never see reviews like these today. While there are still games out there primarily played only on PCs, the overlap is such that there's nothing that gamers haven't seen before on both sides of the aisle. 2002 was an entirely different story. The next review we're going to check out comes from the official Xbox magazine. At the time, Morrowind was a huge console-exclusive game for Microsoft. You'll find that they are much more positive about the game. Quote, "While Morrowind certainly isn't the prettiest Xbox game we've played to date, it delivers an acceptable level of performance, with more than a few stellar effects just not possible on other consoles. The beauteous pixel-shaded water, awe-inspiring weather effects, and 3D audio to name a few. Add some truly engrossing gameplay and storytelling on top of intuitive controls, and Morrowind is a game role-playing fans should enjoy, and for quite a long time at that. There are so many things to do, places to see, people to meet and kill, and items to find in this game that you couldn't hope to see it all in one playthrough. If you rush and you're good, it's possible to beat the main quest in 30 to 40 hours. However, factor in the almost limitless number of subquests you can seek out, and the purely insane amount of locations to explore, and 60 to 100 hours is more likely. The best thing is the game doesn't try to force your hand at all. You can proceed with the main quest at your leisure and via nearly any playstyle you wish, as a noble crusader, whimsical magician, or the vilest of thieves. When the game starts, you don't know who you are, where you are, or why you are there. By answering a few simple questions, or by creating a custom character from scratch, you determine your character class and attributes. You learn just the bare minimum to get you started on the main quest, which typically casts you as the possible cure to a terrible blight that is taking over the land. Or, you can choose to ignore the main quest and simply live as an adventurer in Vardenfell, the island province that Morrowind is set in, exploring its towns, dungeons, and landscape to your little medieval heart's content. And Vardenfell is a wonder to explore. The environments are beautiful and varied enough to keep things interesting, and the artistic style of the game is unmatched in its beauty and attention to detail. But all this 3D glory comes at a price. On occasion, the frame rate does some dipping and things get a bit sluggish, but with all that is going on in the world, you hardly notice. Overall, the gameplay is fluid enough that the occasional glitches don't drag down an enjoyment of the game significantly. Morrowind is a meandering, thoughtful, exploratory experience, not a frenetic bloodfest. The pace of the game reflects this, and may be a turnoff for some players, especially those more used to the spiky-haired antics of console RPGs. The controls deserve special kudos for making all of the game's various interfaces accessible. Even the combat is handled well by the Xbox pad, especially considering the massive amount of keys required to maneuver around on the PC. The game can be played via a third-person view, but this view is pretty much useless during most combat. We did have some niggles in regard to play balance. Powerful items are often extremely easy to find early in the game, for example. Plus, while the game is well populated with NPCs, they do not react to the changing day or night cycle or go about their daily business. They're always in the same places doing the same things whenever you show up, and the AI's path-finding abilities are often laughable. NPCs and monsters continually get stuck walking into objects they could easily sidestep, for instance. Those small things aside though, the joy of this is that you will never be left wanting for additional content for many, many hours to come, as Morrowind is the Xbox equivalent of War and Peace." End quote. Their final score comes in at an 8.1, with a final question asking, is this the right type of RPG for a console? Which I think is really a sign of the times. As I said before, it is hard to explain unless you were there how different console and PC RPGs were back then. PC and console gaming was drastically different, but RPGs were in a different universe altogether. Console gaming was dominated by Sony and Nintendo, and RPGs were mostly made by companies like Squaresoft and Enix. PC RPGs were entirely different, like Baldur's Gate or Neverwinter Nights. In the 90s and early 2000s, a game like Morrowind simply belonged on PC. But Bethesda truly was visionary in that they gave the game a chance with a group of gamers that had never experienced a game like that before. I'd say it paid off for them. Now, we're going to take a look at what PC reviewers thought of the game. These guys aren't fish out of water here. Many of the elements Morrowind had were not entirely new in the PC world, so you'd imagine that the barrier to entry would not be anywhere near as steep. The review I read back in the day that sticks with me came from Computer Gaming World. Writer Ron Doolan has the following to say about Morrowind on PC. Quote, "Morrowind comes close to being the massive, sprawling, open-ended role-playing epic you've always dreamed of. The opening sequence is ingenious and offers a fitting introduction. You have been mysteriously released from prison and led from a transport ship to a census office. After completing your paperwork, which functions as the game's character creation process, you are set free to do as you please. The world of Morrowind is your oyster. Your character's origin as an ex-con is appropriate, because Morrowind is all about freedom. Your role is whatever you choose it to be. There are guilds, religious factions, and political factions. You can ally yourself with any combination of these or none at all. You can follow the main story, which reveals the reasons behind your release and puts you on a journey toward discovering and possibly fulfilling ancient prophecies, or simply wander around the game's many dungeons and towns. There are so many tasks, so many people to help and hunt, that you'll be hard-pressed to stick to any single goal for very long. You are often encouraged to go off and find other things to do, and not stick to any particular thread for too long. Your freedom extends to the character you choose to play. You can follow one of the basic templates, choose from generic fighters and thieves to more exotic witch hunters or spell swords, or you can build your own custom character from the many skills available. And if you don't like the character you create, you can always pick up skills as you proceed through the game. Morrowind doesn't follow the standard system of leveling up, so your character doesn't gain experience in the usual sense. Instead, you gain levels as your skills increase, and your skills increase through use or training. The system is good but not without faults. A fighter who uses a sword and shield will advance more rapidly than one who uses a two-handed sword, because the former is making use of two skills and the latter is using only one. Choosing your skills is important. They affect everything. Non-player characters will react more amicably to you if you have a good speechcraft skill. Locks can be picked and traps disarmed more easily with the high security skill. Become skilled at enchanting and you can imbue weapons and armor with powerful bonuses. and you should really become good at enchanting. It may be the most powerful skill in the game. Make a sword that leeches health with every successful strike and you'll be practically invincible. This may or may not be a good thing. Although Morrowind accommodates a wide variety of characters and choices, the result is that it can occasionally seem mechanical. NPC interactions are a prime example, being often generic and lifeless. Picking locks and disarming traps is simply a matter of arming the right tool and trying over and over again. You suffer no consequence for failure. There are other problems. The real-time melee combat is a bit too basic. You have a few different moves, but it feels more like a first-person slasher than a traditional RPG. There isn't much variety among the monsters, and so combat gets repetitive after a while. Merchants are dirt poor, and thus selling off big-ticket items is often impossible. But Morrowind ships with a relatively easy-to-use editor, and mods and plugins of all varieties have already started to appear. It's simple and encouraged to change anything you don't like. Too easy? Make it harder. Can't sell stuff? Give the merchants more gold. Unfortunately, the editor can't fix two of the game's biggest shortcomings: occasional crash bugs and a journal that records virtually every one of your actions but fails to put the information into a usable format. The journal is an anal retentive nightmare of confusion. But to nitpick on Morrowind's mechanical faults is to miss the big picture. The world is full of surprises. There are frequent moments that are downright awe-inspiring, like reaching the summit of a mountain and seeing the ruins of a buried city sprawled out beyond the mist below you. Most everything in the game is visually impressive, but it's more than that. You can enter every ruin, every tomb, and there is constant anticipation of finding some rare artifact or weapon, or even a book that will tell you more about Morrowind's voluminous history. New areas await discovery, and traveling between the populated areas is more than just a routine set of encounters. The journey itself is as exciting as any particular story thread you choose to follow. The Elder Scrolls III Morrowind is one of the most ambitious role-playing games ever, combining the story of a single-player game with the intriguing exploratory aspect of an MMORPG. It's the kind of game you imagined when the genre was in its infancy, when monochrome blobs and boxy mazes seemed to have limitless potential. There are problems with some fundamental mechanics, but Morrowind offers a huge world of interesting paths and choices, and its faults just serve as occasional reminders that it's only a game." End quote. In the end, Computer Gaming World gives Morrowind a 4.5 out of 5, and says that it is almost more a way of life than a game. Morrowind is the definitive open-ended RPG epic. So I'd say that this review encompasses my memories of Morrowind far more than the console reviews did, even though I first played Morrowind on the Xbox. Perhaps it requires the right kind of player, and there were many of us who played only on consoles back then, but we were the right kind of player without ever realizing it. There are several other outlets that gave Morrowind a great score on PC. Game Informer rated it a 9 out of 10, saying that it is, quote, "one of the most in-depth and cerebral role-playing games I've ever had the pleasure of playing." IGN gave it a 9.4, saying that, quote, "Morrowind isn't perfect and its system requirements are huge, but its accomplishments outweigh any reservations in my opinion. It isn't for everybody, but then what game is? This one shows more planning, talent, aesthetic programming and design, and creative vision than anything I've played in a very long time." GameSpot gave it an 8.7, saying, quote, "Morrowind offers some of the best value for the money of any single-player game currently available, and it ranks up there in terms of size, scope, and quality with some of the best games the role-playing genre has ever had to offer." And finally, according to Metacritic's short synopsis of the review, PC Gamer gave it a 90%, saying rather appropriately, quote, "I'll still be playing it in months, if not years from now. That's for sure." Morrowind stands with a Metacritic score of 89 and a user score of 89, one of the rare games out there with both outstanding critical and user reviews that also achieved significant commercial success. I love going back and rereading reviews for games that ended up changing the industry in some way, or were so successful and long-lasting that people still talk about them to this day. I think Morrowind checks both of those boxes in one way or another. It was a different era, and Morrowind was really one of the first major PC games that was able to successfully bridge the gap between PC and console. From there, the Elder Scrolls franchise really took off, and with it, brought all kinds of new gamers over to PC, while simultaneously proving that in-depth games like Morrowind could work and be successful on consoles. So what are your thoughts? Was there a Morrowind review you remember from back in the day? Did you even care about reviews back then? Let's discuss in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe, maybe click that bell icon, and as always, thank you so much for watching.